On the night of July 11, 2025, a quiet residential street in Belgrade, Florida transformed into a crime scene that would expose failures extending far beyond a single address. Inside a modest home on Southwest Avenue, investigators would document evidence of violence so systematic it contradicted every assurance the legal system had provided. What appeared initially as a domestic tragedy would reveal itself as the predictable conclusion to a documented pattern, one where every warning had been filed, recorded, and ultimately ignored. This is a true crime investigation into the death of Shante Butts, a 32-year-old mother whose attempts to protect herself became a case study in how institutions respond when survival depends on them taking action before tragedy strikes. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The humid air that night carried the kind of stillness that precedes catastrophic events. Neighbors would later report hearing sounds that could have been fireworks or could have been something else entirely. The distinction matters in retrospective analysis, though in the moment, most people chose the interpretation that allowed them to return to their evening routines. Inside the residence, furniture lay overturned in patterns consistent with desperate evasion. Walls bore impact marks that forensic analysts would later measure and photograph. The silence that followed the disturbance was what one responding officer would describe as oppressive, the kind that makes experienced investigators understand immediately that they have crossed from emergency response into homicide documentation. When Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies arrived shortly after 9 in the evening, they found a scene that required both immediate medical attention and careful preservation of evidence. The young male who had placed the emergency call stood outside, his clothing bearing signs of the chaos within. His voice, recorded in the 911 dispatch, carried the particular quality that emergency operators are trained to recognize, not panic, but the forced calm of someone trying to communicate essential information while processing something no child should witness. Inside, they found Shante Butts with gunshot wounds that trauma surgeons would later determine were unsurvivable. Her injuries told a story of close-range violence, of someone targeted with intent rather than caught in crossfire or accidental discharge. The scene contained multiple indicators that this was not a random home invasion or a burglary gone wrong. This was intimate violence, the kind that unfolds when control has been challenged and restraining orders exist only as papers in a courthouse file. Shante Butts was born in West Palm Beach in the early 1990s, entering a world that would require her to develop resilience before she had language to describe what resilience meant. Her early childhood moved through the foster care system, an experience that child development researchers have extensively documented as creating particular psychological challenges around attachment and belonging. The specifics of her placement history remain protected by privacy regulations, but Shante herself spoke publicly about what that transience created in her, a hunger for stability, for a home that would remain consistent, for relationships built on choice rather than bureaucratic assignment. She was eventually adopted, finding a family structure that provided some of the continuity she craved, though the years of uncertainty had already shaped her understanding of what security meant and how fragile it could be. Those who knew her from her teenage years described someone determined to create for her own children what she had spent years searching for herself. This was not abstract ambition, but specific intention. She envisioned a home where her children would know they belonged unconditionally, where they would not wake, wondering if today would bring another transition. That vision became the organizing principle of her adult life, influencing every major decision she would make about work, relationships, and how she structured her days. When Shante became a mother, that abstract determination crystallized into daily practice. Her eldest son became both her first child and in many ways her motivation to build something sustainable. Photographs from this period show a young woman navigating the specific challenges of single motherhood while developing the hustle mentality that would define her next decade. She did not have the luxury of a single career path or a 9-to-5 schedule that aligned with childcare availability. Instead, she constructed an income from multiple sources, each requiring different skills and producing unpredictable revenue. She worked as a home health aide, a role that demands both physical stamina and emotional labor. The work involves assisting individuals with basic daily functions, often in their own homes, requiring care providers to navigate complex family dynamics while maintaining professional boundaries. It is exhausting work, frequently undervalued in economic terms, despite the essential nature of the service. Shante approached it with the dedication of someone who understood what it meant to need help, and to have that help provided with dignity. Her supervisors would later describe her as reliable and compassionate, someone who showed up consistently even when schedules shifted or assignments proved more challenging than anticipated. But one income stream was never sufficient for the life she was building. Shante established her own cleaning business, which she named Polished by Shay, creating a brand that reflected both professionalism and personality. She built a client base through word of mouth and social media, offering residential and commercial cleaning services that prioritized attention to detail. Her business allowed her some schedule flexibility that traditional employment could not provide, letting her arrange work around her children's school activities and medical appointments. She also explored creative entrepreneurship through a venture she called Intercore Creations, designing custom floral arrangements that incorporated unconventional elements, liquor bottles, currency, specialized decorative touches that made each piece distinctive. These creations found a market for celebrations and events, becoming another income source that required artistic skill alongside business management. Shante's presence on social media began as personal documentation, but evolved into something more deliberate. She started sharing videos that mixed humor with unfiltered commentary on her daily reality. Her content was not polished or carefully curated in the manner of professional influencers. Instead, it carried the rough authenticity of someone speaking directly to people who shared similar experiences. She developed a series of comedy sketches focused on what she termed deadbeat daddy culture, using satire to address the economic and emotional imbalance that many single mothers navigate. Her observations were specific: the calculations required to cover expenses alone, the emotional labor of explaining a parent's absence to children, the social dynamics that scrutinize maternal choices while excusing paternal neglect. Her followers responded not just because the content was humorous, but because it articulated frustrations that often remain private. She was verbalizing what many experienced, but had not seen reflected in mainstream conversations about parenting and responsibility. Her videos were viewed thousands of times, creating a community of viewers who saw their own struggles acknowledged. Shante described herself as a comedian, though perhaps social commentator would have been equally accurate. She used laughter as both shield and weapon, a way to process hardship while maintaining some control over her narrative. Her online persona was bold and unapologetic, someone who refused to perform gratitude for circumstances that should not require such resilience in the first place. Behind the humor, though, remained her primary identity and motivation. She was a mother whose every venture existed to create stability for her children. Every late-night cleaning job, every custom arrangement delivered, every video edited and posted was part of a larger project, building the secure home she had dreamed about since childhood. That project collided with a relationship that would ultimately destroy it. Little Mac Williams entered Shante's life as someone who initially appeared capable of contributing to the family structure she was building. He was the father of her youngest children, which created a connection that extended beyond romantic involvement into co-parenting responsibilities. The relationship followed patterns that domestic violence researchers have extensively documented: an initial period where affection and support masked controlling tendencies, followed by gradual escalation of manipulation and intimidation. Shante did not immediately recognize the danger, a reality that professionals emphasize when countering the common question of why someone does not simply leave at the first sign of trouble. Abusive relationships often intensify slowly, with each boundary violation normalized before the next occurs. By the time the danger becomes undeniable, leaving has become significantly more complicated and potentially more dangerous than staying. Shante eventually recognized that the relationship was damaging her, and by extension her children. She made the decision to end it, a choice that required both courage and practical planning. Ending an abusive relationship is not a single conversation, but a process involving housing changes, financial reorganization, custody negotiations, and emotional preparation for the consequences of asserting independence. Shante began that process, believing that legal mechanisms existed to protect her during the transition. She would discover repeatedly and ultimately fatally that the gap between legal protections on paper and actual safety in practice can prove insurmountable. What Shante did not know when she began that relationship, and what became relevant only as she tried to escape it, was little Mac Williams's documented history of violence against women. His criminal record revealed a pattern that stretched back more than a decade, a timeline suggesting that the violence Shante experienced was not anomalous, but consistent with established behavior. In 2014, approximately 11 years before Shante's death, a woman reported to law enforcement that Williams had committed sexual battery against her. Medical documentation from that incident recorded visible injuries including swelling, bruising, and a hematoma on her forehead, significant enough that attending physicians noted its severity in their reports. The charges filed included domestic battery by strangulation, false imprisonment, and additional felonies that together carried the potential for substantial prison time. The legal outcome, however, did not reflect the severity of the documented violence. Williams served 36 days in jail before being released. Researchers studying recidivism in domestic violence cases have identified short incarceration periods as a risk factor for repeated offenses, particularly when not accompanied by mandatory intervention programs or supervised release conditions. The brief detention appeared to have no deterrent effect on Williams's behavior. 4 years later, in 2018, another woman came forward with allegations that Williams was stalking her and repeatedly violating a restraining order that had been issued for her protection. Restraining orders, also called protective orders or orders of protection depending on jurisdiction, are civil court orders that legally prohibit one person from contacting or approaching another. Violation of these orders is a criminal offense, though enforcement varies significantly based on available law enforcement resources and judicial priorities. The woman reported that Williams appeared at her residence and workplace despite explicit legal prohibition, behaviors that meet the legal definition of stalking under Florida statutes. Once again, charges were filed. Once again, the consequences proved minimal relative to the potential penalties. The legal system's response to Williams's behavior established a pattern that would prove deadly. Criminal justice researchers distinguish between two theories of punishment: deterrence, which assumes that consequences will discourage future offenses, and incapacitation, which physically prevents further harm through imprisonment. Williams's case suggests that neither approach was effectively applied. His sentences were too brief to serve as deterrence and too inconsistent to provide protection through incapacitation. This pattern continued when Shante became involved with him, though by then she had no access to the information that might have informed her risk assessment. Criminal records are theoretically public information, but accessing and interpreting them requires knowledge of legal databases and an understanding of what specific charges indicate about behavioral patterns. Most individuals entering relationships do not conduct background investigations, relying instead on personal interactions and disclosed information. By the time Shante understood who Williams actually was, she was already entangled in the relationship and facing the specific dangers that arise when victims attempt to escape. The relationship deteriorated in ways that followed documented patterns of escalating domestic violence. Initially, there were arguments and emotional manipulation. Then came attempts to control Shante's movements, her finances, and her social connections. The isolation that characterizes abusive relationships serves multiple purposes for the abuser. It removes external support systems that might help the victim leave, eliminates witnesses who might intervene or document the abuse, and creates psychological dependence by making the abuser the victim's primary social connection. Shante resisted this isolation more successfully than many victims, maintaining relationships with family and friends who would later become crucial witnesses to both the abuse and her attempts to escape it. The first documented incident of physical violence between Williams and Shante occurred in circumstances that police reports would later detail. Williams was arrested and charged with battery, beginning Shante's engagement with the legal mechanisms theoretically designed to protect domestic violence victims. She filed for a restraining order, initiating a legal process that requires victims to document abuse, often reliving trauma in detailed affidavits that judges use to determine whether protection is warranted. The order was granted, legally prohibiting Williams from contacting Shante or approaching her residence. On paper, she now had legal protection. In practice, she had a document that carried authority only when law enforcement chose to enforce it. This distinction would prove critical. Williams violated the restraining order almost immediately, appearing at Shante's home despite explicit legal prohibition. She called law enforcement, following the prescribed protocol for restraining order violations. Deputies responded, documented the violation, and filed charges. Williams was arrested, processed through the criminal justice system, and released with minimal detention. The cycle repeated. Williams would violate the order, Shante would call for enforcement, charges would be filed, and Williams would be released with warnings that carried no apparent weight. Each repetition reinforced two lessons: that Shante could not rely on legal protection to keep her safe, and that Williams faced no meaningful consequences for ignoring court orders. Domestic violence advocates describe this pattern as one of the most dangerous failures in the current legal system. Restraining orders work only when violations result in swift and certain consequences. When enforcement is inconsistent, the orders themselves can increase danger by angering abusers who face no real deterrent, while their victims believe they have protection that does not actually exist. The violence escalated according to patterns that researchers have extensively documented in domestic violence homicide cases. In July of 2024, approximately 1 year before Shante's death, Williams was arrested for choking her. Strangulation in domestic violence contexts is not merely another form of assault. Medical and criminological research has established that non-fatal strangulation is one of the strongest predictors of eventual homicide in abusive relationships. A study published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine found that domestic violence victims who have been strangled are 7 times more likely to be killed by their abuser than victims who experience other forms of assault. The physiological reason relates to the level of rage and control required to strangle someone. It is an intimate, sustained act that demonstrates both intent to cause severe harm and willingness to cross boundaries that most aggressors avoid. Law enforcement agencies have increasingly adopted strangulation as a critical risk indicator, with many jurisdictions implementing special protocols for cases involving choking or attempts to restrict breathing. Williams was charged with battery by strangulation, a felony under Florida law that acknowledges the elevated danger this specific form of violence represents. He was convicted, marking one of the few instances where the legal system appeared to take the danger seriously. He was sentenced to 157 days in jail, the longest period of incarceration he would serve in his entire documented history of violence against multiple women spanning more than a decade. 157 days for nearly killing someone in a manner that research identifies as a red flag for homicide. He served the sentence and was released. Shante had cooperated with prosecution, testified about the violence, and secured a conviction. The reward for her courage was less than 6 months of safety before her abuser returned to the community, with no ongoing supervision, no mandated intervention programming, and no restrictions beyond the restraining order that he had already demonstrated he would ignore. After his release, Williams's behavior intensified in ways that law enforcement would later reconstruct through witness statements and digital evidence. He began what prosecutors would describe as a stalking campaign, appearing near Shante's residence, following her vehicle, and sending messages that alternated between pleading and threatening. Stalking is defined under Florida law as the willful, malicious, and repeated following, harassing, or cyber-stalking of another person. It is a crime that often precedes more serious violence, representing an escalation from opportunistic contact to systematic tracking and intimidation. Shante reported these violations, documenting dates, times, and circumstances in detailed reports to law enforcement. She was building a paper trail, following the advice that victims are routinely given about how to protect themselves through documentation. That paper trail would later illustrate not her failure to take appropriate action, but the system's failure to respond meaningfully to documented danger. Friends and family members would later describe their growing alarm as they watched the situation deteriorate. Shante told them directly that she believed Williams was going to kill her. This was not dramatic exaggeration or abstract fear, but a specific prediction based on his escalating behavior and his demonstrated disregard for legal consequences. She spoke to her mother about her fears. She confided in friends. She made multiple reports to law enforcement. Each conversation, each report, each request for help became evidence not of her paranoia but of her accurate risk assessment. The professionals trained to evaluate domestic violence danger had failed to reach the conclusion that Shante herself had recognized, that little Mac Williams represented a lethal threat, and that existing interventions were inadequate to contain that threat. In the days immediately before her death, Shante's fear intensified to the point where she made an extraordinary decision. She left her own home, the residence she had worked multiple jobs to maintain and where her children lived, because she believed staying there made her too accessible to Williams. This is the reality that people who have never experienced intimate partner violence often fail to understand. Shante was not failing to leave her abuser. She had already left him more than a year earlier. She was fleeing her own home because the legal system's failure to incapacitate her abuser had left her responsible for her own protection in ways that legal mechanisms should have made unnecessary. She stayed with relatives, hoping that removing herself from her predictable routine might provide safety. She continued documenting violations of the restraining order. She continued attempting to access protection through official channels. And she continued living with the knowledge that her survival depended on her ability to outsmart someone who had already demonstrated willingness to kill her and who faced no meaningful consequences for pursuing her. The surveillance of her movements, the violation of legal orders, the escalating desperation in Williams's attempts to locate her, all of this was documented and reported. Law enforcement had the information necessary to assess the danger. The question that would haunt the investigation after her death was why that information never translated into action that might have saved her life. July 11, 2025 began as a day that Shante might have believed represented some measure of safety. She was not at her own residence. She had taken precautions to make her location less predictable, but at some point during that day, Williams located her. The exact sequence of events remains partially reconstructed from evidence rather than direct witness accounts, though investigators were able to establish a timeline through forensic analysis and the testimony of Shante's eldest son. Williams appeared at the residence where Shante was staying on Southwest Avenue in Belgrade. Witnesses reported seeing a confrontation outside the home, suggesting that the violence did not begin indoors, but rather started in a public space where intervention might have been possible had anyone understood what they were witnessing. The confrontation moved inside, either because Williams forced entry or because the dynamics of the situation compelled movement to a more private location. Once inside, the violence escalated rapidly. Forensic analysts examining the scene noted furniture displaced in patterns consistent with someone attempting to evade an attacker. Items knocked from surfaces, chairs overturned, objects that normally rested on shelves found scattered across the floor. Each piece of evidence documented a desperate attempt to escape someone determined to reach their target. The struggle was not brief. Physical evidence suggested it extended through multiple rooms, indicating sustained pursuit rather than a single violent encounter. At some point during this pursuit, Williams produced a firearm. Firearms transform domestic violence situations in ways that research has extensively documented. According to data compiled by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely that the woman will be killed. This is not merely about weapon lethality, but about the psychological dynamics when an abuser has access to lethal force. Guns eliminate the possibility of physical resistance. They allow killing from a distance that makes intervention more difficult. They represent a level of premeditation that distinguishes impulsive violence from calculated murder. Williams fired the weapon at close range. Ballistic analysis would later determine the proximity based on powder residue patterns and wound characteristics, though the specific details remain part of the ongoing legal proceedings. Shante was struck multiple times. The shooting occurred inside the residence, in circumstances that left no ambiguity about intent. This was not a weapon brandished as intimidation that accidentally discharged. This was not a shooting that occurred during a struggle for control of the firearm. The evidence indicated deliberate firing at a person attempting to evade gunfire, an act that meets every legal definition of premeditated murder. In the immediate aftermath, as Shante lay mortally wounded, her eldest son made the decision that would provide investigators with crucial information and provide prosecutors with an eyewitness account of his mother's final moments. He called 911. The recording of that call, which would later be entered as evidence but not released publicly out of respect for the minor victim, captured several critical facts. The boy identified the shooter as Little Mac Williams. He described his mother's injuries. He provided the location for emergency responders, and he did all of this while processing trauma that will likely affect him for the remainder of his life. Child psychologists specializing in trauma note that witnessing parental homicide creates complex psychological effects, including post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, disrupted attachment patterns, and lifelong questions about their own role in events they could not have prevented. Shante's son became both witness and survivor, his testimony crucial for justice, while his emotional recovery remains ongoing. Williams fled the scene before law enforcement arrived, beginning a pursuit that would last several hours and involve multiple agencies. The nature of his flight suggested not panic, but calculation. He did not remain at the scene or surrender to responding officers. He did not make the common claim of self-defense that some domestic violence perpetrators attempt when caught immediately after killing their partners. Instead, he left, requiring investigators to treat the situation as an active manhunt for a dangerous individual who had just committed murder and might remain armed. Deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office established a perimeter and began canvassing the area based on witness descriptions of the vehicle Williams had been driving. They issued alerts to neighboring jurisdictions, providing vehicle information and emphasizing that the suspect should be considered armed and dangerous. The manhunt involved coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, with helicopters providing aerial surveillance and ground units checking locations where Williams had known associates or previous addresses. The search required several hours, during which investigators processed the crime scene, while simultaneously pursuing the suspect. This dual operation is standard in homicide investigations, but creates particular challenges when the suspect remains at large and potentially able to access additional victims or resources. Law enforcement eventually located Williams at a residence several miles from the shooting scene. The tactical approach to his apprehension required careful planning. He was believed to be armed, had just demonstrated willingness to use lethal force, and was facing charges that would likely result in life imprisonment or capital punishment. These circumstances create high risk that suspects might resist violently rather than surrender peacefully. Deputies surrounded the location and attempted to establish communication with Williams. The details of the arrest negotiation remain part of the investigative record, but Williams ultimately surrendered without additional violence. He was taken into custody, transported to jail, and formally charged with first-degree murder with a firearm, attempted murder, and possession of a firearm by a felon. The firearm charge stemmed from Williams's prior felony convictions, which legally prohibited him from possessing weapons. This prohibition existed before the shooting, meaning Williams had committed an additional crime simply by accessing the gun he used to kill Shante, a crime that theoretically should have resulted in prosecution had anyone been monitoring his activities after his previous release. When investigators interviewed Williams following his arrest, his responses followed patterns familiar to detectives experienced in domestic violence homicides. He denied responsibility, claiming ignorance of events that neighbors had witnessed and that forensic evidence clearly documented. He insisted he had not fired a weapon, despite gunshot residue analysis that would later indicate otherwise. He claimed not to know where the firearm was located, though ballistic evidence would eventually connect the weapon to the shooting. His denials were not unusual. Perpetrators of intimate partner homicide frequently attempt to minimize their actions or construct alternative narratives, particularly in the immediate aftermath before they have consulted with legal counsel. What could not be denied, however, was the physical evidence his own body carried. Investigators noted scratches on Williams's face, neck, and arms, injuries consistent with defensive wounds inflicted by someone fighting for their life. These marks documented the struggle, providing physical evidence that corroborated witness accounts and forensic findings from the crime scene. Shante had fought. She had resisted. She had attempted to defend herself against someone who ultimately possessed both the physical advantage and the weapon that rendered her resistance futile. The scratches on Williams's body were the final documentation of her determination to survive, evidence that would be photographed, measured, and entered into the record of a murder that never should have occurred. The investigative team assigned to Shante's homicide began the process of reconstructing not just the immediate circumstances of her death, but the extended timeline that made it possible. Homicide investigations in domestic violence contexts require examining patterns rather than isolated incidents, understanding that the final act of violence typically represents the culmination of escalating behavior rather than an aberrant moment. Detectives pulled Williams's complete criminal history, documenting every arrest, charge, conviction, and sentence dating back to his first recorded offense in 2014. They reviewed Shante's restraining order applications, reading her detailed descriptions of violence and threats. They interviewed family members who recounted her expressions of fear and her predictions that Williams would kill her. They collected social media posts where she had documented both her life and, occasionally, veiled references to the danger she faced. They obtained 911 recordings from previous incidents, listening to her voice as she reported violations and requested help. Each piece of evidence painted the same picture: a woman who understood her danger, took every recommended precaution, and ultimately died because the system treating her case never matched her assessment of the threat with appropriately protective action. The investigation also examined the institutional failures that enabled the tragedy. Why had Williams been released after strangulation, an offense that research identifies as strongly predictive of homicide? Why had repeated violations of restraining orders resulted in temporary detention rather than escalating consequences designed to deter future violations? Why had prosecutors agreed to plea bargains that reduced serious charges to minor offenses? Why had judges issued lenient sentences that prioritized rehabilitation over public safety in cases involving defendants who had demonstrated no willingness to reform? These questions extended beyond individual responsibility to systemic analysis. The failures that killed Shante Butts were not primarily the result of one negligent judge or one overworked prosecutor. They reflected broader patterns in how the legal system responds to domestic violence, treating it as a private matter rather than a public safety crisis, prioritizing reconciliation over protection, and failing to recognize that lenience toward abusers often translates to death sentences for victims. News of Shante's murder spread through Belgrade and the broader Palm Beach County community rapidly, generating the particular kind of public response that occurs when a preventable tragedy forces acknowledgement of systemic dysfunction. Local news outlets reported the basic facts: a woman shot in her home, a suspect arrested, a domestic violence history. But as details emerged about the documented pattern of abuse and the repeated opportunities for intervention that were not taken, the story evolved from crime reporting to accountability journalism. Reporters requested copies of court records, documenting the timeline of charges, convictions, and lenient sentences. They interviewed domestic violence advocates who explained the research on strangulation as a predictor of homicide and the importance of consistent restraining order enforcement. They spoke with legal experts who analyzed the plea bargaining decisions that had repeatedly reduced Williams's charges, allowing him to avoid the extended incarceration that more serious convictions would have mandated. The coverage created public awareness not just of Shante's individual tragedy, but of the broader patterns her case exemplified. Community members who had known Shante personally spoke publicly about the woman they had lost. Neighbors described her as someone constantly in motion, managing her multiple businesses, while ensuring her children attended school regularly and participated in activities. They recalled seeing her loading cleaning supplies into her vehicle early in the morning and returning late at night, maintaining the exhausting schedule required to support her family independently. Friends shared memories of her humor and creativity, her ability to find moments of joy, despite the stress that dominated her daily life. Her social media followers, who numbered in the thousands, mourned someone they had known only through videos, but who had articulated their own experiences in ways that created genuine connection. The tributes were not generic expressions of sympathy, but specific acknowledgments of who Shante had been: a mother, an entrepreneur, a comedian, a survivor attempting to build safety for her children in a system that proved inadequate to the task. Shante's children faced a future fundamentally altered by violence that should have been prevented. Her eldest son, who had witnessed the murder and made the crucial 911 call, would carry both the trauma of that night and the knowledge that his actions had helped ensure his mother's killer faced justice. Child welfare agencies became involved in determining appropriate placement for the children, navigating the complex question of custody when one parent is dead and the other incarcerated for murdering them. Extended family members stepped forward to provide stability, attempting to maintain some continuity for children whose world had been catastrophically disrupted. The practical challenges were immense. Financial support that Shante had provided through her multiple income sources disappeared immediately, requiring relatives to assume economic responsibility for children they might not have been prepared to support. Educational continuity required decisions about whether to keep the children in their current schools or relocate them to be closer to their new guardians. Mental health services became essential, with therapists specializing in childhood trauma, working to help the children process what they had experienced and witnessed. The long-term effects of parental homicide on children are well documented in psychological research. These children face elevated risks for depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex grief that can persist into adulthood. They must navigate developmental milestones while processing loss and often feeling responsible for events they could not have prevented. They may struggle with questions about whether they should have done something differently, whether their presence somehow contributed to the violence, whether loving their incarcerated parent betrays the memory of their murdered parent. These are impossible psychological burdens for children to carry, yet they are the inevitable consequences of intimate partner homicide. Shante's children would face all of this while also dealing with public attention to their mother's death, media coverage that kept the tragedy visible, and the knowledge that the man who killed their mother was also their father, a relationship that complicates grief in ways that defy simple resolution. The legal proceedings against Little Mac Williams moved forward through Florida's criminal justice system, attracting attention both for the specific facts of the case and for what it represented about systemic failures. Williams was formally charged with first-degree murder with a firearm, a capital offense under Florida law that makes defendants eligible for the death penalty. The charge reflected both the severity of the crime and the documented premeditation. Williams had pursued Shante despite legal prohibition, armed himself, located her despite her attempts to hide, and shot her multiple times at close range. These facts distinguished the case from crimes of passion or impulsive violence, placing it firmly in the category of calculated murder. Additional charges included attempted murder, related to others present during the shooting, who could have been struck by gunfire, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, a charge that existed independent of the murder, but that demonstrated Williams's willingness to violate laws designed to keep weapons away from dangerous individuals. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek the maximum penalty, though whether that would include pursuing capital punishment remained to be determined through internal prosecutorial review and grand jury proceedings. The announcement that prosecutors intended to seek maximum penalties marked a significant shift from the leniency that had characterized previous handling of Williams' cases. This change raised uncomfortable questions. What had changed between the strangulation conviction that resulted in 157 days and the murder charge that now warranted maximum penalties? The answer was obvious and disturbing. Nothing had changed about Williams's dangerousness. What had changed was that Shante Butts was now dead. The system was finally taking seriously a threat that had been apparent and documented for years, but only after that threat had resulted in the exact outcome that appropriate intervention should have prevented. Williams's defense attorneys, appointed or retained to provide representation as required by constitutional guarantees, faced the challenge of defending someone whose guilt appeared well documented and whose criminal history eliminated many potential mitigation arguments. Defense strategies in domestic violence homicide cases typically focus on arguing for lesser charges, questioning the evidence establishing premeditation, or introducing testimony about the defendant's mental state or substance abuse issues that might reduce culpability. In Williams's case, however, the evidence appeared substantial. Eyewitness testimony from Shante's son identified Williams as the shooter. Forensic evidence placed Williams at the scene. The scratches on his body corroborated a violent struggle. His flight from the scene suggested consciousness of guilt, and his extensive history of violence against Shante established both motive and pattern. The defense would likely focus on whether the prosecution could prove the specific elements required for first-degree murder, rather than lesser homicide charges, arguing about distinctions between premeditated murder and felony murder, or other gradations that carry different potential sentences. These legal arguments, while important for ensuring appropriate constitutional protections, operated against a backdrop where the fundamental facts appeared largely undisputed. Williams had killed Shante Butts. The question for trial would be which specific legal category that killing fit within and what penalty it warranted. For Shante's family and for the community watching the case, these distinctions mattered less than ensuring that Williams finally faced consequences proportionate to his actions, and that the systemic failures that enabled the tragedy received appropriate scrutiny. A memorial service held for Shante in Palm Beach County drew a crowd that extended far beyond her immediate circle, reflecting the public response her death had generated. The service was held at a funeral home in West Palm Beach, the city where Shante had been born 3 decades earlier, and where she had dreamed of creating the stable family life she never fully achieved. Friends, relatives, and community members who had never met Shante personally, but who felt connected to her story, filled the space, creating a gathering that was simultaneously grief-stricken and angry. Photographs of Shante at various life stages lined the walls, images of her with her children, celebrating holidays, laughing with friends, working on her floral arrangements. Each photograph documented moments of a life lived with determination and joy despite ongoing adversity. Her children sat in the front row, surrounded by family members attempting to provide comfort while managing their own grief. Her eldest son, who had witnessed his mother's murder, sat with an expression that those present described as beyond his years, a child forced into maturity by trauma. Speakers approached the podium to share memories and tributes. Her best friend spoke about Shante's resilience, describing how she transformed hardship into humor and struggle into strength. A cousin discussed Shante's dedication to her children, noting that every decision she made prioritized their well-being and future. A domestic violence advocate who had never known Shante personally spoke about what her death represented: the systematic failure of institutions to protect vulnerable individuals despite clear warnings and documented danger. That speaker challenged attendees to channel their grief into activism, demanding policy changes that might prevent future tragedies. The service included both celebration of Shante's life and explicit anger at the systems that failed to protect it. Family members did not confine their remarks to generic expressions of loss. They named specific institutions and failures. They called out prosecutors who had agreed to plea bargains that minimized serious charges. They questioned judges who had issued lenient sentences despite clear recidivism patterns. They criticized law enforcement agencies that had documented violations but failed to escalate consequences. And they demanded accountability, not just for Williams, but for everyone whose decisions had contributed to Shante's vulnerability. The memorial was not peaceful acceptance, but rather a demand for justice that extended beyond individual criminal prosecution to systemic reform. In the weeks following Shante's death, community organizations held vigils and organized advocacy efforts focused on strengthening domestic violence protections. Local activists partnered with national organizations specializing in intimate partner violence prevention to develop policy proposals addressing the specific failures that Shante's case had highlighted. These proposals included mandatory minimum sentences for strangulation offenses, recognizing the research establishing this act as a strong predictor of eventual homicide. They called for electronic monitoring of individuals with active restraining orders, using GPS technology to alert victims when their abuser violated proximity restrictions. They demanded prosecution protocols that would limit plea bargaining in cases involving documented violence patterns, ensuring that serious charges resulted in serious consequences rather than reduced penalties. They proposed specialized domestic violence courts with judges trained in trauma-informed jurisprudence and equipped with comprehensive risk assessment tools. They advocated for increased funding for victim services, recognizing that women often return to abusers not because they want to, but because they lack resources to survive independently. And they pushed for policy recognizing that the most dangerous period in an abusive relationship is when the victim attempts to leave, requiring heightened protection during this transition rather than assuming that separation itself provides safety. These advocacy efforts attracted support from unexpected quarters. Law enforcement organizations, often defensive about criticism, acknowledged that current protocols were insufficient. Police unions issued statements supporting better training and more resources for domestic violence response. Prosecutors discussed the need for clearer guidelines about when leniency was appropriate and when it created unacceptable risk. Even some judges, typically reluctant to accept external input about sentencing decisions, participated in discussions about how their individual choices contributed to broader patterns that sometimes enabled continued violence. Domestic violence experts used Shante's case to illustrate principles that research had established, but that public understanding often failed to grasp. They explained that leaving an abuser is not a single decision, but a process that typically requires multiple attempts before achieving permanent separation. They noted that economic dependence, shared children, housing insecurity, immigration status, and justified fear of retaliation all complicate leaving in ways that outsiders who ask, "Why didn't she just leave?" typically fail to consider. They emphasized that restraining orders are tools that work only when consistently enforced, and that inconsistent enforcement can actually increase danger by angering abusers while creating false security for victims. They discussed the lethality assessment tools that exist to help identify which cases present highest risk of homicide, noting that Williams's case would have scored extremely high on these assessments if anyone had applied them systematically. The presence of previous strangulation, escalating violations of court orders, access to firearms, and expressions of desperation all indicated extreme danger. Shante herself had recognized this danger and communicated it clearly. What she lacked was a system that shared her assessment and acted accordingly. Media coverage of the case extended beyond local reporting to national attention, with journalists examining how Shante's experience reflected patterns affecting intimate partner violence victims throughout the United States. Statistics presented in these reports painted a disturbing picture. Intimate partner violence affects an estimated 10 million people annually in the United States. Approximately half of all female murder victims are killed by current or former romantic partners. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. And strangulation, which Williams had already committed against Shante, makes future homicide 7 times more likely. These statistics were not abstract data points, but descriptions of individual tragedies similar to Shante's, cases where warnings existed but action proved inadequate until someone died. Shante's story also prompted discussion about the specific challenges facing Black women navigating domestic violence. Research has documented that Black women experience intimate partner violence at rates comparable to or higher than other demographic groups, but they face additional barriers to accessing help. These barriers include greater economic vulnerability, mistrust of law enforcement stemming from broader patterns of racial discrimination, concerns about contributing to stereotypes or further criminalizing black men, and reduced access to services that may not exist in their communities or may not be culturally responsive to their needs. Additionally, when black women do report violence or seek protective orders, some studies suggest they may receive less supportive responses from institutions than white women in similar circumstances. Whether these disparities affected how Shante's reports were handled remains difficult to determine in individual cases, but advocates emphasize the importance of examining whether systemic racism contributed to the failures that resulted in her death. This examination was not about excusing Williams, whose violence was his own responsibility, but about understanding whether institutional responses might have differed if the victim had been someone whose vulnerability generated more urgent concern from decision-makers. These discussions made many people uncomfortable, particularly in law enforcement and legal communities that prefer to view their work as objective and equitable. But discomfort itself was not reason to avoid the questions. If systemic reform was going to prevent future deaths, it required honest assessment of all the factors that influenced how institutions responded to danger, including factors related to race, class, and social position. Approximately 3 months after Shante's death, as legal proceedings continued and community advocacy maintained pressure for reform, several policy changes began moving through Florida's legislative process. These included bills that would increase penalties for domestic violence strangulation, create dedicated funding for electronic monitoring of high-risk offenders, and mandate lethality assessments in all cases involving intimate partner violence. Legislative progress on these measures remained uncertain, as criminal justice reform proposals often face opposition from those concerned about increasing incarceration or expanding state authority. But the sustained attention to Shante's case created political pressure that made ignoring the issues more difficult. Advocates emphasized that these reforms were not about being tough on crime in ways that had failed communities for decades, but rather about being smart about risk assessment and strategic about resource allocation. Not every domestic dispute required maximum intervention, but cases like Williams, involving documented escalation, repeated violations, strangulation, and explicit threats, clearly warranted more serious response than they received. The goal was differentiation that matched responses to actual danger, rather than treating all cases identically or allowing leniency to become default, regardless of circumstances. Some jurisdictions outside Florida began examining their own protocols in light of Shante's case, recognizing that the failures it revealed were not unique to one state or community. Domestic violence homicides occur with disturbing frequency throughout the United States, and the patterns preceding them are remarkably consistent. Advocates compiled case studies showing how women in California, Texas, Illinois, and other states had followed the same path Shante did, reporting violence, obtaining protective orders, experiencing violations, pleading for help, and ultimately dying, despite having done everything they were told would keep them safe. These comparative analyses reinforced that Shante's death reflected systemic patterns rather than isolated failure, and that preventing future deaths required changing those systems rather than simply prosecuting individual murderers after the fact. Williams remained in the Palm Beach County Jail awaiting trial, held without bond given the severity of charges and his demonstrated danger to the community. His legal team filed standard pretrial motions, challenging evidence and seeking discovery materials, but no serious argument for release appeared viable. The case moved through preliminary hearings where prosecutors presented evidence sufficient to proceed to trial, and where judges made determinations about which evidence would be admissible and which legal theories each side could pursue. These proceedings were largely procedural, though they did reveal some details about the prosecution's strategy and the evidence they intended to present. Witness lists included Shante's son, whose testimony would be crucial but also traumatic. Forensic experts were prepared to discuss ballistic analysis, autopsy findings, and the scratches documented on Williams's body. Character witnesses would testify about Shante's fear in the weeks before her death, and her explicit statements that Williams was going to kill her And documentary evidence would include the complete record of arrests, convictions, restraining order violations, and lenient sentences that together illustrated how predictable this tragedy had been. The trial itself, when it eventually occurred, would force examination not just of what happened on July 11th, but of all the decisions over the preceding years that made that day inevitable. For Shante's family, the trial represented both the possibility of justice and the reality that no verdict could restore what they had lost. For the community watching the case, it was a test of whether the system that had failed Shante in life would at least provide accountability in death. 1 year after the murder, on July 11, 2026, community members gathered at the site where Shante died for a memorial vigil that served multiple purposes. It was an opportunity for continued mourning, a chance to support Shante's children on the anniversary of their mother's death, and a reminder to policymakers and the public that the work of reform remained incomplete. Attendees held candles and placed flowers at a makeshift memorial that had grown over the months since Shante's death. Photographs of her were displayed alongside messages from people whose lives she had touched. Some attendees wore t-shirts printed with Shante's image and phrases like "Say her name" and "Justice for Shante," connecting her case to broader movements demanding accountability when women, particularly women of color, are killed by intimate partners or face violence from those who claim to love them. Speakers at the vigil included domestic violence survivors who shared their own experiences of navigating systems that prioritized process over protection. One woman described obtaining a restraining order after her husband nearly killed her, only to have him violate it repeatedly with no consequences beyond brief detention and warnings. She had survived, she explained, not because the system protected her, but because she had resources to relocate, family who could help her hide, and eventually because her abuser found another victim to target instead. She spoke of her guilt that her survival came partially from his redirection toward someone else, and of her determination to work for reforms that would provide genuine protection rather than false reassurance. Another speaker, a prosecutor who had not worked on Shante's case but who specialized in domestic violence prosecution, discussed the systemic pressures that sometimes led to plea bargaining decisions that prioritized case resolution over victim safety. She acknowledged that overloaded court systems, limited detention space, and pressure to move cases efficiently could create incentives for leniency, even when leniency was dangerous. She called on her colleagues to resist these pressures in cases where the danger was clear, arguing that one properly handled high-risk case was more important than clearing dozens of lower-risk matters quickly. Shante's mother spoke at the vigil, her first public remark since her daughter's murder. She described receiving the call that every parent fears, learning that her child was gone and that the death could have been prevented if anyone had listened. She spoke about Shante's childhood, the resilience she developed growing up in foster care, and her determination to create for her own children the stability she had sought for herself. She discussed the frustration of watching her daughter do everything right, leaving her abuser, documenting the violence, seeking legal protection, only to die anyway because the system treated her case as routine rather than urgent. And she issued a challenge to everyone present to honor Shante not just with words and candles, but with action that would ensure other mothers, other daughters, other families would not experience this same preventable loss. The vigil concluded with a moment of silence lasting 157 seconds, symbolizing the 157 days that Williams had served for strangling Shante, the longest consequence he faced before killing her. As attendees stood in silence, many wept openly, grieving both for Shante specifically and for all the victims whose deaths reflect similar failures. When the moment ended, organizers announced ongoing advocacy efforts and encouraged attendees to contact legislators, support domestic violence services, and maintain pressure for the systemic changes that Shante's death had briefly made urgent. The challenge, as advocates knew from experience, was sustaining that urgency beyond the immediate aftermath of tragedy, maintaining focus on prevention when media attention moved to other stories and when the political capital generated by public grief began to dissipate. Shante Butts should be alive. This is not a sentimental statement, but a factual assessment based on what was known, what was documented, and what actions were available but not taken. The information necessary to recognize the danger she faced existed in police reports, court records, and risk assessments that professionals are trained to evaluate. The tools to protect her existed in the form of laws prohibiting contact, allowing arrest for violations, and mandating detention for dangerous offenders. The knowledge about patterns and predictors of domestic violence homicide existed in research literature that law enforcement and judicial systems could have consulted. What was lacking was not information or tools or knowledge, but rather the institutional will to treat her case with the urgency it warranted. Every warning was present, every sign was visible, every call for help was documented. And still, the system prioritized procedure over protection, leniency over safety, and the rights of a documented abuser over the life of a woman trying to survive. Her death represents not individual failure, but collective failure, a system that treats intimate partner violence as a private dispute rather than a public safety crisis, that allows dangerous individuals to remain free because detention space is limited and court dockets are crowded, and that requires women to be perfect victims following every prescribed step before considering them worthy of protection. Shante was not a perfect victim. She was a real person with complexity and flaws, and a life that did not fit neatly into categories that systems prefer. But imperfection does not justify inadequate protection. Every human being attempting to escape violence deserves a system that prioritizes their survival over bureaucratic convenience or the rehabilitation fantasies that imagine dangerous people will reform after warnings they have already demonstrated they will ignore. The legacy of Shante Butts is being written by those who knew her, loved her, and learned from the circumstances of her death. Her children are growing up without their mother, carrying both grief and the knowledge that her death was preventable. Her family continues advocating for reform, channeling their loss into demands for policy changes that might prevent similar tragedies. Domestic violence organizations use her case in training and advocacy, illustrating patterns that research has established and consequences that leniency produces. And in Florida and beyond, legislators, judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials face questions about whether they will implement changes that acknowledge what Shante's death revealed, or whether they will allow the brief attention her case received to fade without producing meaningful reform. This is the measure by which her legacy will ultimately be judged, not whether her killer faces appropriate punishment, though that matters, but whether the systems that failed her evolve to provide genuine protection for future victims. Justice for Shante Butts extends beyond the courtroom where Williams will face trial. It requires institutional acknowledgement of failures and structural changes that make similar failures less likely. It demands recognition that domestic violence is not merely a crime, but a pattern with identifiable risk factors and predictable escalation. It necessitates investment in services that provide victims with resources to survive independently, rather than forcing them to choose between safety and economic security. And it insists that when someone says he's going to kill me, that statement is treated as risk assessment, rather than dramatic exaggeration, that protections are provided as though survival depends on them because survival does depend on them. Shante Butts did everything she was supposed to do. She left her abuser. She documented the violence. She obtained legal protection. She reported violations. She warned everyone who would listen. And she died anyway, killed by someone who should have been behind bars in circumstances that were documented and foreseeable and preventable. Her story is not exceptional. It reflects patterns that domestic violence professionals recognize immediately, patterns that research has extensively documented, patterns that continue producing deaths because institutions resist implementing changes that might save lives, but would require admitting that current approaches are inadequate. The question facing anyone who learns about Shante's case is what they will do with that knowledge, whether it will produce discomfort that fades when attention shifts elsewhere, or whether it will generate the sustained pressure necessary to force institutions to prioritize prevention over process. Shante's children deserve better than growing up knowing their mother predicted her own murder, and no one stopped it. Future victims deserve better than a system that provides protection only on paper, and Shante herself deserved to live, to raise her children, to build her businesses and to experience the stability and peace she worked her entire adult life to create. That she did not get that chance represents a failure that extends far beyond one person, is violence to encompass every institution that had the power to prevent that violence and chose not to act. Rest in power, Shante Butts. Your story will not be forgotten. Your death will not be dismissed as inevitable, and your legacy will be measured in the lives saved by those who refuse to accept that such failures must continue.